Hello, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to the Thread of Hope channel. Today, I have a story for you that I promise will move you deeply. Imagine a young woman who leaves her small town to chase her dreams, finding work as a maid for a millionaire. She feels an inexplicable pull toward him, and he toward her. But when they finally give in to their feelings, everything changes. And when she discovers she is carrying his child, well, his reaction will shock you. Can a man who rejects his own fatherhood ever truly change? Can love overcome fear and pride? You are about to discover a story of redemption that will touch the very core of your heart. Before we begin, I want to thank each and every one of you who follows this channel, who leaves a like, who subscribes, and who shares our stories. You are the reason I continue to be here, bringing you these narratives that make us reflect on life. And please tell me in the comments, what are you doing while you listen to this story? Are you relaxing at home, driving to work, walking in the park, or perhaps doing some chores? I'm always curious to know how our stories become a part of your day. And now, let us begin. Luara wiped the glass living room table for the third time that morning, not because it was dirty, but because she was nervous. There was something in the air of that Curitiba mansion that left her on edge, especially whenever Henrique was near. She had been working there for 8 months, ever since leaving her hometown in the Parana countryside, a place so small that everyone knew everyone, where job opportunities were scarce and dreams felt too big for its reality. At 22, Luara had found the courage to leave it all behind and come to the capital in search of a better life, even if it meant starting from scratch, far from her parents, who had always supported her in everything. The first time she'd seen the job opening for a housekeeper at the mansion of Henrique Salchato Santos, a 29-year-old tycoon who commanded a business empire, she could hardly believe the salary. It was 3 times what she could have earned back home, enough to send money to her parents and still live comfortably in the big city. Henrique was known to be a difficult man, solitary, a bachelor who dedicated his entire life to his work. Luara had heard whispers that he was cold, that he kept everyone at a professional, distant arm's length. For the first few months, she believed it. He barely glanced at her when he came home, offering only a curt nod before disappearing into his office. But something had shifted in recent weeks, and Luara could no longer pretend not to notice. She would feel his eyes on her as she cleaned, organized, or prepared his meals. It was a strange sensation, like an electric current coursing through her body whenever he appeared in the kitchen for coffee and just stood there watching her work. Luara had never felt anything like it. In her small town, she'd had a few suitors, simple, hardworking boys, but none of them had ever awakened the flutters in her stomach that she now felt just knowing Henrique was on his way home. He was an imposing man, tall, with broad shoulders and dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He wore suits that cost more than Luara earned in a year, drove imported cars, and carried himself with an air of command that spoke of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But beneath the powerful facade, something intrigued Luara. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, she would catch a look of weariness on his face, a loneliness he tried to mask with success and money. It was as if all his power and wealth couldn't fill some deep void within him. Luara had always been a dreamer. As a little girl, she would imagine what it would be like to have a family, a house filled with love, children running through the yard. She'd watch her parents embrace in the kitchen while they cooked dinner together, thinking how much she wanted that for herself one day. Working in Henrique's mansion sometimes sent her into daydreams, imagining what it would be like if this house weren't just her workplace, but a true home, with the sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls and the scent of home-cooked meals always lingering in the air. On that particular morning, as Luara was arranging books on the living room shelf, she heard the sound of Henrique's car in the garage. Her heart began to race, as it always did, and she tried to focus on her task, feigning an indifference she didn't feel. Henrique strode into the room with his usual decisiveness, but this time, instead of heading straight for his office, he stopped and watched her. Luara felt his presence like a magnet, pulling all her attention, but she kept arranging the books, trying to hide her growing nervousness. "Good morning, Luara," Henrique said. His voice had a different quality, softer than his usual clipped greeting. She turned to face him, clutching a book to her chest as if it were a shield. "Good morning, Mr. Santos," she replied, noticing the slight tremor in her own voice. Henrique stood there for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. His eyes traveled over her face in a way that made Luara's cheeks flush with heat. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, not just as the maid who took care of his house, but as a woman. He was the first to break eye contact, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd never seen him make before. "You do excellent work," he said, and there was something in his tone that went beyond a professional compliment. The words seemed to carry a heavier weight, a meaning that transcended her domestic duties. Luara's heart pounded even harder. For one wild moment, she imagined him taking a step toward her, imagined him touching her face with those hands she had often noticed were both strong and elegant. But the moment passed. Henrique continued to his office, as he always did, leaving Luara alone in the living room, the book still pressed against her chest, with the unsettling feeling that something between them had just changed forever. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground. She was just a maid, and he was a millionaire. They lived in completely different worlds, but the heart knows nothing of social divides, and hers was already beginning to belong to this mysterious man who hid behind expensive suits and a life of apparent perfection. 2 weeks after that lingering glance in the living room, Luara was finishing up in the kitchen when she heard the garage door open. It was past 8 in the evening, much later than Henrique usually arrived, and she was nearly done for the day. Normally, she would have already left, but she had stayed late to prepare a few meals he could heat up during the week. When Henrique walked into the kitchen, Luara immediately saw that something was wrong. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his hair was disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. "Good evening, Mr. Santos," Luara said, drying her hands on a dish towel. "I've left dinner in the refrigerator for you. It just needs to be heated." Henrique leaned against the kitchen counter and let out a deep sigh, an exhaustion weighing on his shoulders that she had never seen before. "It was a difficult day," he said, more to himself than to her. There was a vulnerability in his voice that made Luara's heart ache with concern. It was the first time she had seen this man, always so controlled, show any sign of weakness. "Would you like me to prepare something for you? Some tea, perhaps?" Luara asked, taking a tentative step toward him. The distance between them shrank, and she could smell his cologne, mingled with the fatigue of his long day. Henrique lifted his gaze and looked directly at her, and in that moment, Luara saw something that stole her breath away. It was no longer the distant, professional gaze of her employer, or even the curious look from a few weeks ago. It was the look of a man seeing a woman, a look so full of longing and need that it made the blood hum in her veins. Luara. He said her name in a way she had never heard before, low and hoarse, as if each syllable held a special significance. You should have gone home by now. But he made no move to step away. Instead of garden, he took a step toward her, closing the small gap that remained. Luara's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. I just wanted to finish a few things, she managed to reply, her voice softer than she intended. You seem tired. Henrique reached out and gently touched her face. His thumb stroked her cheek with such tenderness that her knees felt weak. You're so beautiful, he whispered, as if confessing a secret he had kept for months. Luara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. All the tension and attraction that had built between them over the months finally found its release. Mr. Santos, she began, but he shook his head softly. Just Henrique, he said. Right now, I'm not your boss. I'm just a man who can't stop thinking about you. His words made something inside Luara melt completely. She opened her eyes and met his, seeing all the sincerity and desire he had tried to hide for so long. I think about you too, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Every day, Henrique moved closer still until there was no space left between them, and Luara could feel the heat radiating from his body. I shouldn't be doing this, he said, but his words were a complete contradiction to his actions. His hand moved from her face to her neck, his fingers tracing a path that sent a shiver through her entire body. We both know that, she agreed, but I can't resist anymore. The first kiss was soft, almost hesitant, as if they were both testing whether this was real or just a dream. But the moment their lips met, all the restraint they had maintained for months crumbled, like a dam finally giving way to the pressure of the water. Henrique deepened the kiss, pulling her closer, and she responded with all the passion she had kept locked in her heart since the day she first laid eyes on him. His hands moved to her waist, holding her as if she were something precious he was afraid of losing. Luara had never been kissed like that, with such intensity, such need. She could feel all of his desire, the hunger he had tried to suppress, and it awakened sensations in her she never knew existed. When they finally broke apart for air, Henrique rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathless and trembling. I want you, he said, his voice rough with desire. I want you in a way that's driving me insane. Luara looked into his eyes and saw the same need that was burning inside her. I've never, she started to say, unable to finish the sentence. Henrique understood immediately, and his expression softened with tenderness. We'll go slow, he promised. I'll take care of you. What followed was a delicate dance of discovery and surrender. Henrique led her to his bedroom, each step a silent confirmation. that this was what they both wanted. He was gentle and patient, showing her a world of sensation she had never imagined. Luara gave herself to him completely, trusting him in a way that went far beyond the physical. It was as if two souls, long searching for each other, had finally found their way home. When it was over, they lay tangled in each other's arms. Luara was nestled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat in a rhythm that was still wonderfully fast. Henrique stroked her hair, and Luara felt that something between them had changed forever. It wasn't just physical, it was an emotional connection that ran impossibly deep. That was perfect, she whispered against his chest. You were perfect. Henrique kissed the top of her head and held her tighter. I've never felt anything like this, he confessed. Never. The next morning, Luara awoke alone in Henrique's bed, the early sunbeams streaming through the window and warming her face. For a moment, she was disoriented, trying to remember where she was, until the memories of the previous night washed over her in a warm wave. She smiled, stretching her arm across the side of the bed where Henrique had been, only to find the cool sheets. He had been up for a while. Luara sat up, pulling the sheet over her body, and heard the sound of the shower running in the bathroom. He was getting ready for work, just like any other morning, but she hoped that this time would be different, that he would come and kiss her goodbye before he left. She rose and slipped into her clothes from the day before, smoothing her hair with her fingers as best she could. She went down to the kitchen and began to prepare breakfast, humming softly as she gathered the ingredients. She was eager to see Enrique, to look into his eyes and confirm that last night had been real, that the incredible connection they had shared was still there. She made pancakes just the way he liked them, brewed a fresh pot of strong coffee, and set the table with special care, imagining his face when he came downstairs and saw her there, waiting for him. When Enrique appeared in the kitchen, already dressed in an impeccable suit, his posture as composed as ever, Luara turned to him with a radiant smile. Good morning, she said, her voice brimming with happiness and expectation. But the look on his face froze her. Henrique barely glanced at her, muttering a dry, good morning, as he went straight for the coffee maker, deliberately avoiding her eyes. It was as if the night before had never happened, as if they were two strangers sharing the same space. I made you breakfast, Luara said, trying to keep her tone cheerful. But a knot of anxiety was already tightening in her chest. Henrique poured a single cup of coffee and turned to leave. Thank you, but I'll have coffee at the office today, he replied, still not looking at her. I have an early meeting. The coldness in his voice was a douse of icy water. Luara stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen, watching him walk away, her heart beginning to beat erratically, no longer with passion, but with fear and confusion. The days that followed were a silent torture for Luara. Henrique reverted to being the distant professional boss she had known in her first few months. But now, the distance was a torment. Now she knew what it felt like to be in his arms, to be looked at with desire and affection. He left early and came back late, and when they crossed paths in the house, he would greet her politely before disappearing into his study. The charged moments between them were gone. There were no more lingering glances, nothing to remind her of the passion they had shared. Luara tried to focus on her work, but it was impossible not to dwell on what had happened. She would clean his room and smell the lingering scent of his cologne on the pillows. She would make the bed where they had made love and wonder if she had done something wrong, if she had disappointed him somehow. Perhaps he had realized she was too inexperienced. Perhaps she hadn't been good enough for a man like him, a man accustomed to sophisticated, experienced women. After a full week of his cold shoulder, Luara couldn't bear it any longer. That evening, she waited until Henrique had come home and secluded himself in his study, as had become his routine, and then she knocked on the door. "Mr. Henrique, may I speak with you?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying the tremor in her hands. There was a pause before he answered. "Come in." Luara opened the door to find him sitting behind his desk, staring at documents, not even bothering to look up. "I need to know what happened," Luara said, closing the door behind her. "A week ago, she faltered, searching for the right words. "We were together, and ever since, you've been treating me like I'm invisible. Did I do something wrong?" Henrique finally lifted his gaze, and Luara saw something in his eyes that confused her even more. It wasn't the indifference she had expected. It was pain, conflict, and beneath it all, the same raw desire she had seen that night. "Luara," he said, running a tired hand over his face. "That should never have happened." His words were a dagger to her heart. It was a mistake, a moment of my own weakness. You work for me. I am your employer, and I should never have taken advantage of the situation. Luara felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of him. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Was that all it was to you?" Henrique rose from his chair and turned to the window, his back to her. What Luara couldn't see was the war raging inside him. He couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the way she had given herself to him, the sweetness of her kisses, the sense of completeness he had felt in her arms. He had never experienced anything so intense, so real, and that was precisely what terrified him. Henrique was a man accustomed to being in control, and what he felt for Luara was utterly beyond his control. "It's better this way," he said, still facing the window. "Let's forget it happened and return to our professional relationship." Luara was silent for a moment, processing his words. Then she straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. "I understand," she said, her voice controlled despite the pain that was tearing her apart. "If that's what you want, then that's what will be." She turned to leave, but paused with her hand on the doorknob. "But just so you know, for me, it wasn't a mistake. It was the most beautiful thing that has ever happened in my life." And with that, she left the study, leaving Henrique alone with the crushing weight of his own words. 6 weeks had passed since that painful conversation. Luara had fallen into a fragile professional routine with Henrique. They greeted each other politely during the day. She performed her duties with her usual dedication, and he maintained the respectful distance he had established. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Luara carried a constant ache in her chest, a longing for the man who was so close, yet so impossibly far. She had considered quitting countless times, returning to her parents' town, but something always stopped her. It was as if a part of her was still waiting, hoping he would change his mind, that he would recognize that what they had felt together was too special to be ignored. It was on a Thursday morning that Luara realized something was different. She woke up in the small apartment she rented near the mansion with a sickening lurch in her stomach. a wave of nausea and dizziness that sent her running to the bathroom. After a few minutes of deep breaths, she got ready for work, blaming it on something she'd eaten. But when she arrived at the mansion and began preparing breakfast, the rich aroma of brewing coffee hit her, and the nausea returned with such force that she had to grip the sink to keep from falling. Over the next few days, the symptoms only worsened. The nausea was most potent in the mornings. She developed a strange sensitivity to smells that had never bothered her before, and she felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. At work, she tried to hide it, especially when Henrique was around, but she often had to pause and sit for a few minutes. At first, she dismissed it as stress or fatigue, but when she realized her period was 2 weeks late, a cold chill ran down her spine. She sat on the edge of her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to calculate the dates. The possibility forming in her mind was at once terrifying and thrilling. Luara had always dreamed of being a mother. She had imagined carrying a child, feeling its first kicks, lovingly preparing a nursery. But in her fantasies, it always happened within a happy marriage, with a man who loved her and was eager to start a family. The reality she was facing was starkly different. If she was truly pregnant, the father was the man who had made it painfully clear that what happened between them was a mistake. That Saturday, Luara could no longer stand the uncertainty. She left her apartment early and went to a pharmacy in a distant neighborhood, far from home and the mansion, where she was certain she wouldn't run into anyone she knew. She bought a pregnancy test, hid it in her purse, and returned to her apartment with a racing heart. She locked herself in the bathroom, taking several deep breaths before opening the box. Following the instructions, she took the test and sat on the edge of the bathtub to wait. They were the 3 longest minutes of her life. She stared at the small plastic stick, praying softly, without knowing exactly what she was praying for. Part of her desperately wanted it to be positive. The idea of having a baby, even in these difficult circumstances, filled her with an inexplicable joy. But another part of her was petrified, imagining how Henrique would react, how she would manage to raise a child alone if he refused to accept his responsibility. When the time was up, she looked at the result. 2 pink lines stood out, clear and definite. Positive. Luara was pregnant. She held the test gently, feeling tears well in her eyes, a mixture of joy, fear, and a profound emotion she couldn't name. Inside her, a baby was growing, a part of Henrique and a part of her. The fruit of that perfect night he considered a mistake. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach and whispered, "Hello, my love. Mommy's here, and I already love you so much." In the days that followed, Luara lived on an emotional roller coaster. During her shifts at the mansion, she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it was hard to concentrate when her mind was constantly on the baby growing inside her. One moment, she would be radiant, imagining teaching her child to walk, to talk, to play in the yard. The next, she would be gripped by panic, wondering how she would ever tell Henrique, how he would react. Would he be angry? Would he fire her on the spot? She dialed her mother's number several times, wanting to confess everything, but always hung up before she could speak of the pregnancy. She knew her parents would worry and demand she come home immediately. For a full week, Luara watched Henrique from a distance, trying to imagine what kind of father he would be. She saw him on the phone with his young nephews and noticed how his voice would soften, becoming more affectionate. Sometimes she would catch him smiling to himself when he didn't know she was looking, and it gave her a flicker of hope that perhaps, deep down, he wasn't as cold as he pretended to be. But then she would remember his words in the study, his branding of their night as a mistake, and the fear would return with full force. Luara knew she couldn't put it off any longer. The more time that passed, the harder it would be, and she couldn't hide the pregnancy forever. She decided she would tell him on Friday, at the end of her shift, giving them a moment after he returned from work. She spent the entire day rehearsing what she would say, how she would start the conversation, trying to anticipate every possible reaction. Henrique, I need to tell you something important, she would murmur to herself as she tidied the house. Henrique, something has happened that will change everything, she would try again. When the time came, Luara was more nervous than she had ever been in her life. She heard his car in the driveway and took a shaky breath, summoning her courage. It was now or never. She was going to tell him about their baby, and regardless of his reaction, she was determined to move forward. This child would be loved, would have a mother who would do anything for them, even if their father wanted no part in their life. Luara placed a hand on her belly one last time and whispered, no matter what happens, my love, Mommy will take care of you. When Henrique walked into the mansion that Friday, Luara could see he was different. It wasn't the weariness she had seen months ago, but a tension in his shoulders that suggested a particularly difficult day at the office. He gave her a curt nod, as he always did, and headed for his study. Luara took a deep breath and decided to give him 15 minutes to settle in before she approached him. She tidied the kitchen again, putting away already clean utensils, anything to keep her hands busy while she gathered her nerve. When she finally knocked on the study door, she felt her heart pound against her ribs. Mr. Henrique, may I speak with you, please? She asked, trying to keep her voice firm. It's important. There was a pause from the other side of the door before he answered. Come in. Luara opened the door and found him sitting behind his desk, shuffling through papers. He looked up at her with the same professional expression that had become the standard between them. What is it, Luara? He asked, a hint of impatience in his voice, as if she were an unwelcome interruption. I need to talk to you about something that happened, Luara began, closing the door behind her. She had rehearsed these words all morning, but now, standing before him, they felt alien on her tongue. It's about that night, a few weeks ago. Henrique stiffened immediately, dropping the papers onto his desk. Luara, I already told you that was a mistake, that we would not speak of it again, he said, his voice sharper than usual. I thought we had settled this. Henrique, Luara said, dropping the formal Mr. for the first time since that last conversation. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air, simple and direct. The silence that followed was deafening. Henrique stood completely still, his eyes fixed on her as if he couldn't comprehend what she had said. The color drained from his face, and Luara watched a storm of emotions cross his features. Shock, disbelief, fear, and then something that looked like anger. This can't be happening, he said, rising abruptly from his chair. It can't be. He began to pace the office, running his hands through his hair. Are you sure? Have you taken a test? Seen a doctor? Luara almost smiled despite the crushing tension. We made love. What did you think I would win? Loyalty points? She shot back with a flash of irony. I took a home test. It was positive, and believe me, I'm sure about the symptoms. Henrique stopped pacing and turned to face her, and the look on his face made Luara's heart plummet. It wasn't joy, not even acceptance. It was pure despair. Luara, you have to understand this will complicate everything, Henrique said, his voice tense. My career, my image, my business. I can't have a child with my maid. Do you understand the scandal this will cause? His words stung like a series of slaps. He was thinking of his reputation, his business, everything but the baby growing inside of her. Henrique, it's your child, she said, her voice beginning to tremble with emotion. Our child. No, Henrique shook his head vigorously. I can't be a father right now. Not like this. Not with you, not under these circumstances. He sank back into his chair, burying his head in his hands. You need to resolve this situation, Luara. There are ways to not let this go forward. I'll pay for everything. You don't have to worry about a thing. Luara felt the floor give way beneath her. He was suggesting she get rid of the baby, that she eliminate the life that had just begun to grow inside her. I won't do it, Luara said, her voice gaining strength. Never. This baby is my child, a part of me, and I won't give him up for anything in this world. Tears began to stream down her face, but she didn't care. I've always dreamed of being a mother, Henrique. Always. And now that this dream is coming true, you want me to give up? You want me to get rid of my own child? Henrique lifted his head and looked at her, and Luara saw that his eyes were also welling up, though he fought to maintain control. You don't understand the situation, he said. I have responsibilities, commitments. A child will change everything, complicate everything. Luara wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took a deep breath. Then I'll make things easy for you, she said, her voice firmer now. I'm not getting rid of my child, but you don't have to worry. I can take care of him just fine on my own. Henrique looked at her, his expression confused. I'm only asking for one thing, Luara continued, that you have the decency to take care of me and the child until the baby is born. Give me the means to have proper prenatal care, to eat well, to look after your son's health. But if you don't want to do that, it's fine. You can say so, and I'll leave today. She pressed on. I'll go back to my hometown, move back in with my parents. They'll take me in, and I'll raise my child there, far away from you. You'll never have to see me or the child again. But if you choose that path, I want you to know that you're giving up on your own blood, your own son. Silence once again filled the office. Henrique stared at her for a long time, and Luara could see the war raging inside his mind. For a moment, she hoped he would change his mind, that he would realize this baby could be a blessing, not a problem. But when he finally spoke, his voice was tired, defeated. You can stay at the mansion, he said. I'll take care of everything. The doctor's appointments, the food, everything you and the baby need. But I want to make one thing clear. I'm doing this out of responsibility, not love. When the child is born, we'll talk about what happens next. Luara nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. At least the baby would be born healthy, would have everything it needed, but she knew the journey ahead would be incredibly difficult. Thank you, she said softly. I promise I won't be any trouble. I won't get in your way. Henrique didn't reply, just nodded and turned his attention back to the papers on his desk, signaling that the conversation was over. Luara left the office with a broken heart, but with the certainty that she had done the right thing. Her son would be born, and she would love him enough for two. In the week following that difficult conversation, Luara moved into the mansion. Henrique had prepared one of the guest rooms for her, a large, comfortable space on the second floor, far from his own master bedroom. It was a beautiful room, with a king-sized bed, an enormous wardrobe, and a view of the garden. But to Luara, it felt more like a gilded cage than a home. She brought her few belongings from the apartment she had been renting and tried to make the space her own, placing a photo of her parents on the nightstand and arranging her simple clothes in a closet that was far too large for them. Henrique had also hired a caregiver to assist Luara during her pregnancy. Dona Conceição was a kind woman of 55, experienced in caring for expectant mothers, who came every morning and stayed until late afternoon. She was gentle and attentive, always asking if Luara was feeling anything, if she needed something specific, if her morning sickness was getting better. But as affectionate as Donna Conceição was, Luara couldn't feel at ease. It was strange to have someone watching over her constantly, asking what she wanted to eat, if she had slept well, if she was taking her vitamins. The first few days in the mansion were the hardest. Luara would wake up in the large, silent room, and then, for a few seconds, forget where she was. She missed the sound of the street coming through her apartment window, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs, the sense of independence she had when she lived alone. Now, she was comfortable, had everything she needed, but she felt like a stranger in the very house where she had worked for so many months. During the day, Dona Conceição kept her busy with light walks in the garden, breathing exercises, and conversations about the pregnancy. But the nights were long and solitary. Henrique had returned to his routine of leaving early and coming home late, but now he made a point of avoiding any contact with Luara. If she was in the living room, he used the side entrance to go straight to his office. If she was in the kitchen having breakfast, he would just grab a cup of coffee and take it to his room. They were like two ghosts sharing the same house, each trying not to cross the other's path. Luara noticed the effort he made to avoid her, and it hurt more than she expected. One night, unable to sleep, Luara went down to the kitchen for a glass of milk and heard Henrique talking on the phone in his office. The door was ajar, and she could overhear part of the conversation. "No, Mom, I'm not coming for Sunday lunch," he was saying, his voice weary. "I'm dealing with some personal issues here." There was a pause, and then he continued, "It's nothing serious, just some changes in my life that I need to process." Luara stood frozen in the kitchen, wondering if the personal issues had to do with her and the baby. It was strange to think that her pregnancy was affecting other parts of his life as well. For her medical appointments, Henrique made a point of not going. He paid for everything, leaving the money with Dona Conceição and asking her to accompany Luara to the doctor. Luara understood that he didn't want to be seen with her, that he wanted to avoid speculation, but it made her sad. She saw other pregnant women arriving at their appointments with their husbands, their boyfriends, and wondered what it would be like if Henrique were there, holding her hand, hearing the baby's heartbeat for the first time, seeing the first ultrasound images. Her calls to her parents became more frequent and more difficult. Every week, Luara's mother would call, asking how she was, if work was going well, if she was happy in the city. Luara invented stories about living with a nice family who treated her well, about saving money and thriving. She knew she would have to tell them about the baby eventually, but she still didn't know how to do it without worrying them. They would want to know who the father was. They would want her to come home, and Luara wasn't ready for those conversations yet. In the afternoons, when Dona Conceição had gone home and the mansion fell silent, Luara would spend time in the garden, sitting on a bench under the large tree, her hand on her belly, which still showed no sign of her pregnancy. She would talk softly to the baby, telling him about his father who lived far away, about the grandparents who didn't yet know he existed, about the father who was too scared to accept he was going to be a dad. Your daddy is a good man, she would whisper. He's just scared, but when you're born, he'll love you. I'm sure of it. From his office, Henrique would sometimes look out of the window and see Luara in the garden. He tried not to look, tried to focus on his work, but his eyes always drifted back to her. There was something about the image of her sitting alone, hand on her belly, that stirred something in him he couldn't explain. A part of him wanted to go down, sit beside her, and ask how she was feeling, if the baby was okay. But another part, the part that had always controlled his life, told him it was better to keep his distance, that if he got emotionally involved, things would only get more complicated. At night, after Luara had gone up to her room, Henrique would sometimes wander through the house and stop in front of her door. He could hear the low hum of the television, sometimes a soft song, and he would wonder if she was okay, if she was comfortable, if she was happy. He knew he had offered only the bare minimum, a place to live, food, medical care, but he hadn't offered affection, companionship, or his presence. And for the first time since he learned of the pregnancy, Henrique began to question if he was doing the right thing. It was in the 4th month of her pregnancy that Henrique began to act differently. Luara noticed the change one Tuesday morning as she was in the kitchen, making chamomile tea to calm the nausea that still bothered her from time to time. Henrique came down for coffee before work, as he did every day. But this time, instead of just grabbing his cup and leaving, he stopped and looked at her. "How are you feeling, Utai?" he asked. And there was a genuine concern in his voice that Luara hadn't expected. She was so surprised it took her a few seconds to answer. "I'm okay," she said. "The morning sickness is getting better." Henrique nodded and stood there for a few more moments, as if he wanted to say something else, but didn't know what. In the days that followed, these small interactions became more frequent. Henrique started asking if she had slept well, if she was eating properly, if Dona Conceição was taking good care of her. They were simple, quick questions, but for Luara, who had spent weeks being treated as if she were invisible, that attention meant the world. She began to look forward to those moments, anxious to see him appear in the kitchen in the morning, to hear his voice, asking about her and the baby. One Thursday, Luara was in the garden when she felt her phone vibrate. It was a text from Henrique. "Is everything okay there? Dona Conceição said you looked a little pale this morning." Luara stared at the message, her heart racing. It was the first personal text he had sent her since he found out about the pregnancy. She replied, "I'm fine. Thanks for asking. Just a little tired." His response came quickly. If you feel anything, anything at all, let me know immediately. Luara put her phone away with a smile, feeling that something was changing between them. The messages became a constant. During the day, especially when Henrique was at his company's office, he would text to ask if she was okay, if she needed anything, if she had taken her vitamins. At first, Luara's replies were brief and polite, but gradually, their conversations grew longer. She started telling him about the doctor's appointments, about how the baby was developing, about the symptoms she was feeling. And to her surprise, Henrique showed a genuine interest in every detail. One evening, as Luara was in her room watching television, she heard a soft knock on the door. Luara, may I come in? It was Henrique's voice. She sat up in bed and quickly smoothed her hair. You can come in, she replied. Henrique opened the door and stood in the doorway, holding a bag. I brought some fruits you mentioned you were craving, he said, holding the bag out to her. Green apples and grapes. Donna Conceição said you were feeling sick with other kinds of fruit. Luara took the bag, her eyes welling up. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant he was paying attention to what she said, that he cared about her well-being. Thank you, Luara said, her voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to. Henrique stood there for a few seconds, looking at her in a different way. Actually, I did, he said quietly. I've been an idiot, Luara, a complete idiot. She looked at him, confused. When you told me about the baby, I reacted like a scared child, not like the man I should be. And ever since then, I've been treating you like a problem to be solved, not like the mother of my child. Luara's heart beat faster. It was the first time she had heard him say, my child, when referring to the baby. Henrique, she began, but he shook his head. Let me finish, he pleaded. I've spent these last few weeks thinking a lot, trying to understand why I reacted that way. And I realized it was fear. Fear of taking on such a huge responsibility, fear of not being a good father, fear of my whole life changing. He moved a little closer to the bed, but what I was most afraid of was admitting that that night between us wasn't a mistake. It was the most real thing that has ever happened in my life. Tears streamed down Luara's face. She had waited so long to hear those words, had dreamed of the moment he would acknowledge that what they had shared had been special. I never thought it was a mistake, she said. Not for a second. Henrique sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance, yet closer than he had been in months. I know I hurt you, he said, his voice low. And I know it will take time for you to trust me again. But I want to try. I want to be the father this child deserves. And I want to care for you the way you deserve to be cared for. In the days that followed, the change in Henrique became even more apparent. He started coming home earlier, spending time in the living room, talking with Luara about his day at work. He asked about her doctor's appointments, showing a genuine interest in every detail. When Luara mentioned a craving for chocolate ice cream in the middle of the night, he left the house at 11 o'clock to buy some from the only parlor still open. When she complained of a backache, he brought her a special pregnancy pillow. One evening, as they were discussing baby names in the living room, Henrique looked at Luara and said, I want to apologize again. For everything. For suggesting you get rid of the baby. For treating you like a nuisance. For wasting all these months I could have spent enjoying this pregnancy with you. Luara placed a hand on her belly, which was just beginning to show. The important thing is that you're here now," she said softly. "The important thing is that you want to be a part of this." Henrique moved closer to her on the sofa, and for the first time in months, touched her belly over her shirt. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Daddy's here, and he's not going away again." Luara felt the baby stir, as if responding to its father's voice, and she saw Enrique's eyes well up with tears. "He moved," Henrique said, his voice filled with wonder. "Did you feel that?" "He moved when I spoke." Luara smiled and placed her hand over his. "He recognizes his daddy's voice," she said, and in that moment, for the first time since she'd learned she was pregnant, Luara felt that they were truly going to be a family. By the 6th month of pregnancy, Luara's belly was prominent, and the baby's movements had become more frequent and stronger. It was a magical sensation for her, feeling that life growing inside of her. But what moved her most was seeing how Henrique had transformed. The man who once avoided any contact now sought moments to be near her, to talk about the baby, to participate in every stage of the pregnancy he had missed in the early months. One night, they were in the living room watching a movie when Luara felt a series of particularly strong kicks. She placed a hand on her belly and winced slightly. "Oh, what a little rascal," she said, laughing. "This boy is having a party in there." Enrique immediately turned to her, concerned. "Does it hurt? Should I call Dona Conceição?" Luara shook her head, smiling. "No, it doesn't hurt. He's just very active today. Do you want to feel?" The question came out naturally, but as soon as she said it, she feared he would refuse, that he wasn't ready for that kind of intimacy. But Henrique didn't hesitate. He moved closer on the sofa and cautiously extended his hand. "May I?" he asked. There was a tenderness in his voice that made Luara's heart race. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, right where the baby was kicking. The moment Henrique's hand touched her skin, the baby gave a particularly strong kick, making Henrique's eyes widen with surprise and emotion. "My God," he whispered. "It's incredible. He's really in there, growing, moving." His voice was choked with emotion, and Luara saw that his eyes were glistening with tears. From that night on, these moments became their routine. Whenever Luara felt the baby move, she would call Henrique over to feel it with her. He would rest his hand on her belly for long minutes, talking quietly to his son, telling him about his day at work, promising to teach him how to play soccer, ride a bike, and be a good man. Luara would listen, deeply moved, seeing how Henrique was connecting with the baby in a way she never thought possible. One afternoon, as Luara was resting on the sofa, Henrique came home from work and found her with a hand on her belly, a look of concentration on her face. "What is it?" he asked, approaching immediately. "Is everything okay?" Luara smiled up at him. "Everything's perfect. He just won't stop moving, and I was trying to figure out what position he's in." Henrique sat down beside her. "Can I try?" he asked. Luara nodded, and Henrique placed both hands on her belly, palpating gently. "I think his head is here," he said, touching the top of her bump. "And his feet must be down here, because this is where he kicks the most." "You're becoming an expert," Luara laughed. Who knew the serious businessman would become a baby specialist? Henrique smiled, a genuine smile that Luara hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm learning," he said, "and I'm enjoying it much more than I ever imagined." He kept his hands on her belly, then suddenly leaned down and pressed his ear against it. "What are you doing?" Luara asked, amused. "I'm trying to hear his heartbeat," Henrique replied. "I read online that it's possible if you're very quiet." Luara ran a hand through his hair, a tender gesture she hadn't made in months. Can you hear it? She asked softly. I think so, he whispered. It's a very faint sound, but it's there. These displays of affection became more and more frequent. Henrique started caressing her belly whenever he passed by. Sometimes he would pause in the middle of a conversation just to place his hand where the baby was moving. At dinner, he always asked if she was eating enough, if the baby was active, if she had felt anything different during the day. It was as if he were trying to compensate for all the time he had lost at the beginning of the pregnancy. One night, as Luara was in her room getting ready for bed, Henrique knocked on the door. Can I come in? He asked. I brought you something. Luara opened the door and found him holding a book. It's about pregnancy in the first few weeks with the baby, he explained. I thought we could read it together to learn things at the same time. Luara took the book and flipped through a few pages. It was a complete guide, full of information about each stage of pregnancy, about childbirth, about how to care for a newborn. You bought this? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. I did, he confirmed, and I've marked a few parts I found interesting, especially about how the father can help during labor. This was the first time Henrique had mentioned being present at the birth, and Luara felt a wave of happiness wash over her. You want to be there when he's born? She asked, almost in disbelief. If you want me to be, Henrique replied. I know we still have a lot to talk about what life will be like after the baby is born, how we'll organize everything. But I know I want to be present for the important moments. And there's no moment more important than the birth of my son. Over the following weeks, they spent many nights reading the book together, discussing each chapter, asking each other questions. Henrique made notes in the margins and underlined important passages. Luara realized he was truly dedicated to understanding everything about pregnancy and fatherhood. Sometimes, when they were reading about the changes in a woman's body during pregnancy, Henrique would look at her with an admiration that made her blush. It's incredible what the female body can do, he said one night, how you can create an entire life inside of you. It's the most miraculous thing there is. Luara was happy with Henrique's change, but an insecurity she couldn't completely shake still lingered. They were closer. He was affectionate and present, but he hadn't spoken about his feelings, about what he truly felt for her. She knew he loved the baby. That was clear in every gesture, every word. But what about her? Did he feel anything for her beyond a sense of responsibility for the mother of his child? The question hammered in Luara's mind every night as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what their future would be like after the baby was born. In the early hours of a Tuesday morning, in her 9th month of pregnancy, Luara woke up with a different kind of pain. It wasn't like the discomforts she had felt in recent weeks, the backaches, and the heavy feeling in her belly. This was a pain that came in waves, starting faint and growing more intense, then disappearing completely, only to return a few minutes later. She lay in bed for a while, breathing deeply, trying to understand if this was what she thought it was. When the third wave of pain came, stronger than the last, she suspected it was the beginning of labor, but she decided to wait to be sure. For the next 3 hours, Luara stayed awake, timing the contractions. They were getting more regular and more intense, coming every 10 minutes, then every 8, then every 5. She got up a few times, walked around the room, did the breathing exercises she had learned, but the pain kept growing stronger. As dawn began to break, she knew for certain the baby was coming. It was time to go to the hospital. Luara took a quick shower, trying to calm herself, and went down to the kitchen. Henrique had already left for work. She'd heard his car in the garage a couple of hours earlier when he left for that important meeting scheduled for 8 a.m. It was a negotiation that had been going on for months, a multi-million-dollar contract that could change the course of his business. Luara knew how much he had prepared for this day, and a part of her was relieved not to have to make the decision to interrupt something so important to him. Donna Conceição arrived at 7:30, as she did every day, and found Luara in the kitchen, gripping the sink during a contraction. "Oh my goodness, child," she said, rushing to help. "Is it today? Is the baby coming?" Luara nodded, breathing deeply as the pain subsided. "The contractions have been regular for 5 hours," she explained. "I think it's time to go to the hospital." Dona Conceição immediately grabbed the pre-packed bag and called the maternity ward's emergency service. "Should we call Mr. Henrique?" she asked as she helped Luara into the car. Luara hesitated. "He's in a very important meeting. Maybe it's better to wait and see if it's really labor." In truth, Luara was afraid Henrique wouldn't be able to leave the meeting, that she would end up having the baby alone even after calling him. It was better not to get her hopes up. "If it's the real thing, you can call him later," she said. The drive to the hospital was a blur of anxiety and excitement. The contractions were getting more frequent and stronger, and Luara gripped the car seat with each wave of pain. Dona Conceição held her hand, talking to her to keep her distracted. "Everything will be all right, my dear," she said. "You're strong, and the baby is healthy. Soon, you'll be holding each other." When they arrived at the hospital, Luara was immediately taken to the obstetric emergency room. The nurses ran tests and confirmed she was indeed in active labor, already 6 centimeters dilated. "The baby is going to be born today," the doctor said, smiling. "You're doing great, but it's going to be quick. A first pregnancy rarely progresses this fast." Luara was taken to a comfortable room where nurses helped her change and get settled in bed. "Is someone coming to be with you?" one of them asked kindly. "The baby's father?" Luara looked at Dona Conceição, who stood beside her. "I don't know," she said quietly. "He's in an important meeting at work." The nurse smiled sympathetically. "Let's give him a call. No father wants to miss the birth of his child for a meeting." Luara nodded, but deep down, she was preparing for the possibility of having the baby alone. Meanwhile, Henrique was in his company's conference room, discussing the final details of a contract that could change the course of his business. It was the culmination of an 8-month negotiation, and this meeting was decisive. The investors were present, lawyers reviewing every clause, and everything seemed to be heading toward a perfect agreement. Henrique was focused, presenting numbers and projections, when his cell phone began to ring. He glanced at the screen and saw it was Dona Conceição. For a moment, he considered not answering, but something made him accept the call. "Mr. Henrique," Dona Conceição said, her voice agitated. "Luara is at the hospital. The baby is coming. She's been having strong contractions for 5 hours." Henrique's world came to a halt. He looked around the conference room, at the men in suits waiting for his response on a contract clause, at the papers spread across the table, at everything that represented his professional life. And suddenly, None of it mattered. Which hospital? He asked, already rising from his chair. Mr. Henrique, one of the investors said, we're at a crucial part of the negotiation. Where are you going? Henrique grabbed his jacket and faced everyone in the room. My son is being born, he said, his voice firm. This meeting will have to be rescheduled. One of the lawyers stood up, indignant. Mr. Henrique, this negotiation has been ongoing for months. What kind of professionalism is this? Henrique stopped at the door and turned back to the man. The professionalism of a man who understands that some things are far more important than money and contracts, he replied, his voice clear and steady. My son will only be born once. Business can wait. Henrique ran out of the company, got into his car, and drove as fast as he could toward the hospital. During the drive, he called Dona Conceição, asking for Luara's floor and room number. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and exhilaration. He was going to be a father, a real, actual father, in just a few hours. And Luara was going through all of it alone, thinking he wouldn't show up, believing his work was more important than the birth of their child. When Henrique arrived at the hospital, he raced through the corridors until he found her room. He paused at the door, took a deep breath, and walked in. Luara was on the bed, gripping the side rails during a contraction, her face flushed with effort. The moment she saw him, her eyes instantly filled with tears. Henrique, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You came. I thought you wouldn't be able to leave the meeting. He moved to her side and took her hand. I wouldn't miss this for the world, he said softly. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. How are you doing? It hurts so much, Luara admitted, but I'm happy. So happy. And now that you're here, I feel complete. Henrique kissed her hand and stood by her, holding it tightly through every contraction that followed. He spoke to her in the lulls between the pain, distracting her with silly stories, praising her strength, telling her she was the bravest woman he had ever known. You're doing amazing, he would whisper. Our son is going to have the strongest mother in the world. After 3 hours with Henrique by her side, the doctor announced it was time. Let's meet this baby, she said with a smile. Henrique stayed with Luara through the entire process, holding her hand, encouraging her to push, wiping the sweat from her brow with a cool towel. When the baby finally arrived, a powerful cry echoed through the room. The doctor held the child up for them to see. It's a beautiful, healthy boy, she announced. The baby was placed on Luara's chest, and she held him with infinite care, tears of joy streaming down her face. Hello, my love, she whispered. Mommy loves you so much. Henrique looked at his son for the first time and was overcome by an emotion he had never experienced. The baby was tiny and red, with clenched fists and tightly shut eyes, but he was perfect. And he was the spitting image of Henrique, the same face shape, the same nose, the same brow line. In that moment, Henrique began to cry. He, who had always been a man in control, who never showed emotion in public, stood there shedding tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He looks just like us, Luara said, her gaze shifting from Henrique to the baby. Look at his little nose. It's just like yours. Henrique reached out a finger and gently touched his son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers immediately wrapped around his with surprising strength. Hey, my prince, Henrique whispered, his voice cracking. Daddy's here, and I'm never leaving your side again, I promise. Luara watched Henrique cry, and her heart felt like it would burst with love. Henrique, she said softly, thank you for being here. Thank you for not giving up on us. He met her eyes, holding their son's finger with one hand and her hand with the other. Luara, I love you, he said, the words emerging with absolute certainty. I love you. I love our son, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve you both. Can you forgive me for being an idiot? For taking so long to understand that you two are the best thing that has ever happened to me? 3 weeks had passed since the birth of little Gabriel, a name they had chosen together in the hospital. Luara was recovering well, and the routine with the baby was starting to settle in at the mansion. Henrique had taken 2 weeks off from work, a move that stunned everyone who knew him, to stay home, help Luara, and get to know his son. He would wake in the middle of the night when Gabriel cried, change diapers, and give him baths with a patience and tenderness Luara never knew he possessed. For those 3 weeks, they had lived like a real family. Henrique slept in the guest room next to Luara's to be close if the baby needed anything during the night. They had breakfast together, cared for Gabriel together, and every evening they would gather in the living room to talk about their day and the new things the baby had done. It was everything Luara had ever dreamed of: a united family, a present and loving father, a home filled with love. But as the days went by, a worry began to grow in Luara's heart. Henrique was a wonderful father. That was undeniable. He loved Gabriel with an intensity that moved her every day. But what about her? He had said he loved her in the hospital, in the emotional rush of their son's birth, but he hadn't mentioned it since. They were sharing a house, raising a baby together, but they were still sleeping in separate rooms. They still hadn't talked about their future as a couple. Luara began to wonder if Henrique was only there for Gabriel. Was he being kind to her simply because she was the mother of his child? Was he taking care of her out of a sense of obligation and responsibility? The insecurity she had managed to push away during her pregnancy returned with full force. Did he really love her? Or was he just doing what he thought was right? Would he grow tired of the situation once Gabriel was a little older and ask her to leave? One evening, after a particularly fussy day, Gabriel had finally fallen asleep. Luara and Henrique were in the living room, talking about the little changes they were seeing in the baby each day. Gabriel had started to focus his gaze on their faces, a development that fascinated Henrique. I swear he already recognizes me, Henrique said, smiling. When I get near his crib, he stops crying. Luara smiled at his enthusiasm, but inside, her anguish was growing. Henrique, she said suddenly, interrupting the conversation. I need to ask you something. The seriousness in her voice made him stop talking and give her his full attention. Of course, he said. What is it? Luara took a deep breath, mustering the courage to ask the question that had been tormenting her for days. Are you here for me, or just for Gabriel? The question came out more directly than she had planned, but she had to know the truth. Henrique looked at her, his expression one of confusion. What do you mean? Luara shifted on the sofa, clearly uncomfortable but determined to clear the air. I want to know if you really love me, if you want to be with me because you love me, or if you're just here because I'm the mother of your son. The words were heavy with all the insecurity she had been holding inside. Because if it's just an obligation, a responsibility I'd rather know now. The silence that followed was heavy. Henrique watched her for a few moments, processing her question, and Luara saw a range of emotions cross his face. Luara, he began, but she cut him off. I don't want you to stay with me out of pity or duty or because you think it's the right thing to do. I want a true love, or I would rather be alone. Gabriel will have a wonderful father either way, I already know that. But I need to know if you truly want to spend the rest of your life with me, or if you're just here because circumstances forced you to be. Henrique stood up from the sofa and began to pace the room, running a hand through his hair. Luara's heart pounded in her chest, terrified of his answer. Maybe she shouldn't have asked. Maybe it was better to live in uncertainty than to discover a painful truth. You want the truth, Henrique said, stopping in front of her. The truth is, I've been falling in love with you since that first night we spent together. The truth is, when I said it was a mistake, I was lying to myself because I was scared. Luara looked up at him, stunned. That was not the answer she had been expecting. I had never felt anything like what I feel for you, he continued, his voice low and earnest. And it terrified me. I've always controlled everything in my life. And then you appeared, making me feel things I didn't even know existed. When you told me you were pregnant, I panicked, not just because of the baby, but because I knew I couldn't run from what I felt for you anymore. Henrique knelt on the floor in front of her and took her hands. I love you, Luara. I love the way you care for Gabriel, the way you've turned this house into a home, the way you make me want to be a better man. I'm not here out of obligation. I am here because you and Gabriel are my family. You are everything I ever wanted, but never knew I needed. Tears welled in Luara's eyes. Henrique released one of her hands, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box. Luara's eyes widened in disbelief. Luara, I bought this 2 weeks ago, but I was waiting for the right moment, he said, opening the box to reveal a beautiful engagement ring, its diamonds sparkling in the soft light of the room. I want to marry you, not because I have to, but because I can't imagine my life without you. Henrique, Luara whispered, the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I can't believe you're doing this. He smiled, that genuine, heart-stopping smile she loved so much. Marry me, Luara. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you are the most important woman in the world to me. Let's raise Gabriel together, and maybe have more children in the future. Let's be the family we both always dreamed of. Luara looked from the ring to Henrique's eyes and saw all the sincerity and love he felt for her. Moi, she said, smiling through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you. I love you so much, Henrique. I've always loved you, even when you said it was a mistake. Even when you pushed me away. I never stopped loving you. Henrique slid the ring onto her finger, then stood to kiss her, a kiss filled with love, promises, and the future they would build together. When they parted, they held each other in a tight embrace, and Henrique held her as if he would never let go. Now we're a real family, he whispered into her ear, and I think Gabriel needs a little sister, a little girl who looks just like you. Luara laughed and pulled back slightly, a mischievous glint in her eyes. You're in a bit of a hurry for a man who didn't want a child, aren't you? The bun is barely out of the oven and you already want to light the fire again. Henrique let out a loud, happy laugh that Luara adored. Maybe a little later, he said, still chuckling. We have our whole lives ahead of us. And they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, laughing together, knowing they had found a true love and the family they had always dreamed of. 3 years later, the mansion in Curitiba was unrecognizable. What had once been a silent, elegant house was now filled with toys scattered across the living room, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, and the sound of laughter echoing through the halls. Gabriel, now 3, was chasing the dog Henrique had bought him for his second birthday. And in Luara's arms was 6-month-old Giovanna, who had been born looking exactly as Henrique had dreamed, just like her mother. Luara sat on the veranda, nursing Giovanna and watching Henrique play with Gabriel in the garden. It was incredible how much the man had changed. The serious businessman who thought only of work had given way to a playful father who came home every day at 5, never missed bath time, and woke up in the middle of the night to change diapers without a single complaint. Henrique had learned to balance work and family in a way Luara had never thought possible. "Daddy, teach me to kick harder," Gabriel yelled, running after the ball. Henrique laughed and ran with his son, pretending he couldn't catch up to give the boy an advantage. "Like this, champ," he said, positioning Gabriel's foot. "Look where you want the ball to go and kick with all your might." Gabriel kicked the ball with all the force his 3-year-old legs could muster, and Henrique celebrated as if it were a goal in the World Cup final. Giovanna stirred in Luara's arms, opening her dark eyes, which were identical to her father's. "Hi, my princess," Luara whispered, stroking her daughter's cheek. "Are you watching how crazy your daddy and brother are?" The baby made a face that resembled a smile, and Luara's heart melted. Having a daughter had been even more emotional than she had imagined. Watching Henrique with Giovanna was a beautiful sight. He treated her as if she were made of porcelain, speaking to her in a voice even softer than the one he used with Gabriel. "Love, come here," Henrique called, running toward the veranda with Gabriel in his arms. "Gabriel wants to show his little sister how he kicks the ball." Luara smiled and stood up, holding Giovanna carefully. They gathered in the garden, and Gabriel, with the solemnity of a 3-year-old, positioned the ball and kicked it gently in Giovanna's direction. "Look, Gigi," he said, using the affectionate nickname he had invented for his sister. "One day, I'm going to teach you how to play soccer, too." Henrique wrapped an arm around Luara's waist and kissed the top of her head. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly as they watched Gabriel play. "More than I ever imagined possible," Luara replied, leaning against his chest. "You've made all my dreams come true, Henrique. A family, a house full of love, healthy children. It's everything I ever wanted." Henrique held her tighter, feeling the same overwhelming love and gratitude that had filled him every day since they were married. Their wedding had taken place when Gabriel turned 1, a beautiful ceremony held in the garden of their own mansion. Luara's parents had traveled from far away to meet their grandson and son-in-law, and they were charmed by Henrique instantly. Luara's mother couldn't stop repeating how obvious it was that he was madly in love with her daughter, and her father had said he'd never seen Luara so happy. Henrique's family had also welcomed Luara with open arms, especially his mother, who was ecstatic to finally have a daughter-in-law and grandchildren to spoil. "You know what I was just thinking," Henrique said, watching their 2 children play in the garden, "that maybe, in a couple of years, we could give them another little brother or sister." Luara laughed, giving him a playful look. "Mr. Henrique Santos, have you turned into a baby-making machine? Is that it?" He threw his head back and laughed, kissing the side of her neck. "I just want a house full of little Luaras and little Henriques running around." Luara shook her head, still smiling. Let's take it slow, my love. Let's let Giovanna grow up a little first. That night, after the children were asleep, Luara and Henrique settled in the living room to talk about their day, just as they did every evening. It was Luara's favorite time when they were alone and could talk about everything, from Gabriel's latest mischief to their dreams for the family's future. Do you regret anything? Henrique asked, gently twirling a lock of her hair. Leaving your hometown? Coming to work for a difficult man like me? Luara chuckled, pressing a soft kiss to his chest. I only regret one thing, she said, not kissing you on the very first day I set foot in this house. Henrique smiled, pulling her closer. If you had, I would have run for the hills, he confessed. I wasn't ready for you back then. I needed time to understand that love isn't something you control. It's something you simply accept. Luara gazed at his face, seeing the new maturity and wisdom he had gained over the years. And are you ready now? She teased. Now, I'm more than ready, he answered, his voice soft. I'm ready for a lifetime of love, family, and happiness with the most incredible woman in the world. And so they held each other, listening to the quiet hum of the house where their two children slept, knowing they had built the very life they had always dreamed of together. And that is how the story of Luara and Henrique ends, as proof that true love can transform anyone. Henrique began by rejecting fatherhood out of fear, only to discover that sometimes life's greatest blessings arrive disguised as problems. Luara teaches us that a woman who knows her own value never settles for scraps of love. And Henrique shows us that it's never too late to change and to fight for what truly matters. What started as a single night of passion blossomed into a beautiful family, with Gabriel and Giovanna as living proof that God always has bigger plans for us. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like below and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future stories. Tell me in the comments, which part of the story moved you the most? Was it Henrique's transformation, Luara's strength, the birth of Gabriel? Please share this video with someone who needs to hear a beautiful story today. May God bless each and every one of you with an abundance of love and family. A big hug, and until the next story.